Before you click away, I need you to know something that keeps me awake every night. The 7 stories we're about to hear aren't just horror. They were warnings that Canadian authorities have been actively suppressing for decades. Children are still disappearing near rivers. Hitchhikers are still encountering drivers with impossible black eyes. And something in Stanley Park is still screaming. Here is what they want to tell you. Every single case has been officially closed with explanations that contradict the physical evidence. But they found the connection. The one pattern that links disappearances from Saskatoon to Vancouver to the Quebec wilderness. And at the end of this video, I'll reveal the survival rule that could save your life. It is not in any guidebook. It is not taught by park rangers. But it is the reason certain indigenous communities have survived for thousands of years in places where everyone else vanishes. But first, do these 4 things immediately. Subscribe to Vesper Shroud right now. Next week, I am releasing the footage that made 3 Canadian police officers quit their jobs. Dashcam recordings from Highway 16 that show something getting into vehicles with victims. Subscribers see it 48 hours early. Smash that notification bell. These stories have a 72-hour window before pressure forces them down. You need to see what is coming. Comment your location and current time. I am tracking something disturbing. Viewers who watch these Canadian stories report hearing singing they can to identify. Voices calling their names from places with no people. Your data might reveal why. In story number 3, there is a detail about lighthouse footsteps that every Coast Guard veteran knows but never discusses. If you catch it, you'll understand why certain towers are never staffed anymore. One warning: if they driven Highway 16, if they camped in Quebec forests, if they heard knocking from sealed mine tunnels, you might finally understand what you encountered. Now, let me tell you about the river woman who has been singing to children for 200 years, and why nobody can make her stop. Story 1. Saskatoon. There's missing children on the frozen river. I keep hearing the singing, and I can make it stop. My name is Robert Sinclair, and for the past 7 years, they worked as a river patrol officer for the South Saskatchewan River near Saskatoon. I am a trained rescue specialist. I've pulled people from the water. I've navigated these currents in every season. I've done this job for long enough that I thought I understood every danger the river could present. But I was wrong about something fundamental, something that has haunted every night since the winter of 2018. And I can't stay silent anymore. This is a terrifying account of what I discovered, and I need to warn people before another child disappears into that frozen darkness. The first child went missing on November 18, 2018. Her name was Hannah Greer, and she was 7 years old. She lived with her mother in a modest house 3 blocks from the river. Hannah was a quiet child, according to the reports, the type who didn't make much of a fuss, who played alone in her room for hours drawing pictures and reading books. On that night, her mother had put her to bed at 8 o'clock. The house was secure, doors locked, windows closed against the cold November wind that swept down from the prairies. By 9 o'clock, Hannah was gone. Her window was open from the inside, and her small footprints led down the snowy yard toward the direction of the river. Nothing else was disturbed. Her mother, panicked and confused, called the police immediately. The search began within the hour, and it was intense. The police brought dogs, organized volunteers, and conducted a systematic search of the area around the river. But they found nothing. No sign of Hannah. No indication of struggle or abduction. Her footprints simply ended about halfway between her house and the river, as if she had simply vanished into the night air. The official conclusion was that Hannah had wandered toward the river in some kind of sleepwalking state and had fallen through the ice. The river patrol was called in to search the frozen surface and the dark water below, but nothing was recovered. Hannah was declared drowned, presumed dead, and the case was filed away as a tragic accident. Children sometimes walked in their sleep. Sometimes they didn't wake up in time to prevent disaster. But I remembered something from that night that made the official explanation feel incomplete. When we arrived at the search site, one of the volunteer searchers mentioned something unsettling. She said that before Hannah disappeared, residents in the neighborhood had reported hearing a woman singing. The singing came from the direction of the river, late at night, a haunting melody that seemed to drift across the frozen landscape. It was eerie, the volunteer said. Unsettling. Not the kind of sound you do you expect to hear at night in a residential neighborhood in late fall? I asked around, and several other people confirmed the same thing. A woman singing, coming from the river, late at night, in the weeks before Hannah disappeared. None of the volunteers had thought much about it at the time. Homeless people sometimes sheltered near the river. Maybe it was just someone camping in an unconventional place. But the singing was notable enough that multiple people had mentioned it to the police. The police investigation didn't pursue that lead. They filed it away as unrelated to Hannah's disappearance. They concluded she had sleepwalked out of her house, been drawn toward the river for reasons unknown, and had fallen through the ice into the dark water below. Case closed. 2 months later, another child disappeared. This time it was a boy named Marcus Chen, age 9. He lived on the other side of the river, about 2 miles from where Hannah had vanished. Marcus, his father, found his bed empty in the morning. His window was open from the inside. Snow had blown across his bedroom floor, and once again, his footprints led from his house in the direction of the river, terminating in an inexplicable way about halfway to the water's edge. This time, the search was even more extensive. The police brought in divers. They used special equipment to search the river, but they found nothing. No body, no clothing, no indication that Marcus had ever reached the river or fallen through the ice. He had simply ceased to exist somewhere between his house and the water. The official explanation remained the same: sleepwalking, tragic accident, another child lost to the darkness and the cold. But this time, I was listening more carefully. Residents reported the same thing: a woman singing. The sound came from the direction of the river, late at night, a melody that seemed to pull at something deep in the brain, a tune that you couldn't quite remember but that felt familiar in the most disturbing way. People described it as hypnotic, as if the singing had a quality that made them want to follow it, to walk toward it, to find the source of that eerie voice. Several residents mentioned that they'd woken up in the middle of the night and found themselves standing at their windows, drawn there by the sound, before they realized they were awake. Some had sleepwalked to their doors before family members woke them up and kept them from going outside. The singing seemed to have an effect on people, particularly on children, as if it was specifically designed to lure them out into the darkness. I brought this information to my supervisor, and he took it seriously. We organized extra patrols along the river during the night. We coordinated with local police to increase surveillance in the neighborhoods near the water. We put out alerts asking people to report the singing immediately if they heard it. And for a while, there was relative calm. No children disappeared, but then the singing started again in February. And this time it was different. This time, the sound was closer, more intense, more present. People described it as almost unbearably beautiful, a melody that seemed to touch something primal in the human mind. And this time, I heard it myself. I was on night patrol on February 16th, driving along the river road just after midnight. The temperature was dropping, the wind picking up, the kind of night when the landscape feels hostile and empty and utterly isolating. That is when I heard the singing. It came from the direction of the frozen river, a woman's voice, clear and distinct despite the distance and the wind. The melody was haunting, complex, with harmonies that seemed impossible for a single voice to produce. But what disturbed me most was the quality of the voice itself. It didn't sound entirely human. There was something wrong with the timbre, something that made my skin crawl with an instinctive recognition of danger. I stopped my vehicle and got out, my training overriding my fear. I approached the riverbank, calling out to see if anyone needed assistance. The singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind and the creaking of the ice beneath my feet. I didn't see anything. No figure, no shadow, no indication that anyone or anything had been there. But the cold was intense, far colder than the ambient temperature should have been, as if the presence of whatever was singing had drained all warmth from the air. That night, I filed a detailed report of what I experienced. I included my theory that whatever was luring the children was intelligent, deliberate, and still actively hunting. I suggested that we increase patrols even further, that we issue warnings to residents about not allowing children to be left alone, that we take this threat seriously. My supervisor called me into his office the next morning. He was sympathetic but firm. He said that my experience could be explained by fatigue, stress, and the power of suggestion. I heard reports about a woman singing, and my mind had created an auditory experience based on expectation. It was a common psychological phenomenon. He suggested I take some time off, get some rest, and try to maintain objectivity about the case. I knew I hadn't imagined the singing, but I also knew that if I pushed too hard, I'd be removed from the investigation entirely. So I remained silent and continued my patrols, and I started keeping my own records, separate from the official reports, documenting every instance of the singing, every disappearance, every connection I could find. In March, another child went missing, a girl named Sophie Rodriguez, age 6, and in April, a boy named David Park, age 8. By the summer of 2019, 5 children had vanished from the Saskatoon area, all living near the South Saskatchewan River, all with the same pattern of open windows and mysterious footprints that terminated inexplicably before reaching the water. The official count remained 5 missing children, all classified as drowning victims or accident cases. But the terrifying pattern was impossible to ignore if you were willing to look at it. I began researching the history of the South Saskatchewan River. I dug through old newspaper archives, interviewed longtime residents, and talked to indigenous peoples who had lived in the region for generations. And I found something that should have been impossible, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up with a primal sense of wrong. There were historical accounts of children disappearing near the river going back over 200 years. Indigenous legends spoke of a spirit that inhabited the water, a woman who had drowned in the river centuries ago under terrible circumstances, a being whose grief and rage had transformed her into something hungry, something that called to children from the darkness. The legends called her the River Woman, the singing woman, the entity that lured children into the water so they could join her in the cold darkness beneath the ice. In the historical accounts, the disappearances would occur in patterns, seasons when the singing was most prevalent, times when the water seemed particularly cold and the ice particularly thick. The accounts matched what we were experiencing almost exactly. The singing before the disappearance, the open windows, the mysterious footprints, the complete absence of bodies or evidence. All of it matched. I brought this information forward, but my supervisor shut me down immediately. He said I was chasing folklore and superstition, that I was becoming obsessed with a case that had no rational explanation. He suggested, very firmly, that if I continued pursuing this line of investigation, I would be removed from my position. I had a choice. I could accept the official explanations and move on with my job, or I could continue down this path and lose my career. I chose to continue investigating quietly, but something was changing in my behavior, something I couldn't quite explain. I found myself drawn to the river at night. I would finish my shifts, and instead of going home, I would drive to the riverbank and park, waiting, listening for the singing. And eventually, I would hear it. The woman's voice, eerie and haunting and utterly terrifying in its beauty. I started having dreams about children. In the dreams, I could see them standing on the frozen river, looking down at the ice beneath their feet. I could see the ice beginning to crack. I could see their faces as they realized what was happening. And I could hear the singing, louder now, more intense, almost like laughter beneath the surface. When I woke from these dreams, I would find myself standing at my window in my night clothes, drawn there by something I didn't understand. My wife noticed that I was sleepwalking, that I seemed distant and preoccupied. I told her it was the stress of the job, the missing children weighing on my mind. But it wasn't that. It was something else. Something was calling to me the way it called to the children. In June of 2019, a 6th child disappeared, a boy named Thomas Wright, age 7. The same pattern. Open window, mysterious footprints leading partway to the river. No body, no evidence. The police were baffled and frustrated. The case was generating media attention. Questions were being asked about why so many children were dying in the river. That night, after Thomas disappeared, I drove to the river in a state I can only describe as compulsion. I wasn't in control of my actions. My hands moved the steering wheel. My feet worked the pedals. But it wasn't me making those decisions. Something else was operating my body, guiding me toward the frozen water. I parked near the riverbank and got out of the vehicle. The night was clear. Stars visible above. The cold so intense it seemed to have weight and substance. And I heard the singing again, but this time it was different. This time, the melody seemed to be addressing me directly, calling my name, telling me to walk toward the water, to step out onto the ice, to join the children in the darkness below. I took 3 steps toward the frozen surface before my wife's voice in my head stopped me. She had called me that night, wondering where I was. The sound of her voice, the memory of her concern, was enough to break whatever hold the singing had on me. I staggered backward, away from the river, and collapsed in the snow, gasping, realizing with complete and absolute clarity what was happening. The river woman wasn't just hunting children. She was hunting me. She had been calling to me through the dreams and the compulsions and the irresistible urge to listen to her singing. She wanted me to join the children in the water. She wanted me to become one of the missing. Another mystery, another unsolved disappearance. I drove myself to the hospital that night and admitted myself to the psychiatric ward. I told the doctors that I was experiencing delusions, compulsions, and suicidal ideation. I didn't tell them about the river woman or the singing or the missing children. They would have dismissed it as a manifestation of my psychological breakdown. Instead, I focused on the symptoms, the behaviors, the ways I was losing control of my own mind and body. I spent 3 weeks in the hospital. I was prescribed antipsychotic medications. I underwent psychological evaluation. And I slowly, painfully regained control of my actions. But I never stopped hearing the singing, even in the hospital, even with medication, even surrounded by other people. The singing was always there, at the edge of my awareness, calling to me, reminding me that I was marked, selected, that eventually I would answer the call. When I was released, I requested a transfer. I told my supervisor that I needed to leave River Patrol, that the stress of the missing children cases had become too much for me to handle. He was sympathetic and made the arrangements. Within a month, I was working a desk job in the provincial office, miles away from the river, away from the singing, away from the direct pull of whatever entity inhabited that water. But the singing never stopped, and I realized something terrifying that I can't ignore any longer. The River Woman ISN, limited to Saskatoon. As they researched further, they found historical accounts of similar disappearances near rivers across Canada. Children vanishing near the Bow River in Calgary, the Athabasca River in Edmonton, the Red River in Winnipeg, all with the same pattern. All preceded by accounts of a woman singing, all leaving no bodies, no evidence, nothing but mystery and grief. It's as if there is a network of these entities, river spirits that hunt children, that lure them into the water with their eerie singing. And the most disturbing part is that I believe they reconnected to each other, communicating across vast distances, expanding their hunting grounds, preparing for something larger. I also believe that I am not the first person they marked. There are others like me, former investigators, rescue workers, people who have come into contact with these entities and have been chosen for transformation. Some of them have already disappeared. Some of them are still out there, fighting against the compulsion to return to the water, slowly losing the battle as the singing grows louder in their minds. The terrifying truth is that no one is taking this seriously. The police classify the disappearances as drowning accidents. The media reports them as tragic mishaps. The families of the missing children are left with unanswered questions and unbearable grief. And all the while, the river woman continues to sing, continues to call, continues to lure more children into the darkness. I'm writing this account now because I can feel the pull intensifying. The singing has become louder, more persistent. I am having to use every ounce of will to stay away from the river, to resist the compulsion to return to that frozen water. Some nights, I wake up in my car parked near the riverbank with no memory of driving there. Some mornings, my shoes are wet with river water, and I have gaps in my memory that I can't explain. I don't know how much longer I can resist. And I know that when I finally give in, when I finally walk out onto that ice and let the river woman pull me down into the darkness, there will be no one to warn the next person, no one to continue investigating, no one to stand between that horrifying entity and the children it continues to hunt. If you live near any river in Canada, if your child has ever woken with an inexplicable desire to go outside at night, if you ever heard a woman singing in the darkness, then you need to listen to what I am telling you. The singing is real, the disappearances are real, and the entity that dwells in the deep, cold water is still hunting, still calling, still claiming more victims as the seasons turn and the ice forms again. That chilling sound you hear at night, that haunting melody drifting across the frozen water, that is not the wind. That is not your imagination. That is the river woman, and she knows your name. She has been singing to you for a very long time, and eventually, you are going to answer. Story 2. Vancouver Stanley Park Screamer. That sound, I can still hear it even now, 3 years later, in the silence of my apartment late at night. A scream that doesn't match any creature that should exist. A scream that made every cell in my body understand, at a fundamental level, that I was in the presence of something profoundly wrong. My name is Derek Hollis, and I was a wildlife biologist working for the British Columbia Parks Authority. I studied animal behavior for 22 years. I tracked bears in the interior, documented cougar populations, and spent more time in wilderness than most people spend in their homes. I thought I knew the sounds of the forest. I thought I understood the range of vocalizations that animals could produce. But then I heard the screamer, and everything I believed about the natural world changed. The first documented report came on March 2nd, 2019. A jogger named Michael Torres was running the Seawall Trail in Stanley Park, one of Vancouver's most popular recreational areas, when he heard an eerie, high-pitched scream coming from the dense forest on the park's interior. The sound was so terrifying, so utterly wrong, that Michael stopped running and called 911. When officers arrived, they found him standing on the trail, pale and shaking, describing a noise he couldn't identify, something that made his instincts scream danger. The police conducted a search, but they found nothing. No animal, no person, nothing that could have produced such a horrifying sound. They filed Michael's report and assumed he heard an urban legend brought to life by his own fear and imagination. The city is full of sounds that can be misidentified when you alone and your adrenaline is high. But Michael wasn't the only one. Over the next 2 weeks, 7 more joggers reported hearing the same terrifying scream. Always in Stanley Park. Always in the late afternoon, between 4 and 6 o'clock. Always coming from the interior forest, far enough away to be unidentifiable but close enough to be unmistakably terrifying. Each report was nearly identical. A high-pitched, almost human scream, but wrong somehow, containing harmonics that didn't match the human voice, a quality of absolute primal fear and anguish that made people's hair stand on end. The BC Parks Authority called me in to investigate. I met with the joggers who reported the screaming. I walked the Seawall Trail multiple times, recording ambient sound with sophisticated audio equipment, trying to establish a baseline of what sounds were normal in the park. I consulted with other wildlife biologists and animal behavior specialists, and I became increasingly convinced that what the joggers were reporting was real, documented, and completely unexplainable. The sounds weren't matching any known animal vocalization. I compared the recordings against databases of animal screams from around the world. Primates, felines, canids, birds of prey. None of it matched. The frequency was too high, the duration too long, the complexity too sophisticated. Whatever was producing that sound existed outside the normal range of animal vocalization I was trained to identify. I increased my investigation. I set up permanent audio recording stations throughout the park. I hired additional researchers to conduct observation patrols. I analyzed the temporal patterns of when the screaming occurred, the geographic location of the sightings, the seasonal variations. And within 3 weeks, I had developed a profile of the entity based on behavioral patterns alone, without ever seeing it directly. The screamer was intelligent. It had a territory. It had a schedule. It vocalized at specific times, possibly for communication or possibly for hunting. The frequency and intensity of the screams suggested an animal of significant size, something large enough to generate the acoustic power we were measuring. And most disturbingly, the vocalizations seemed to be targeted. They appeared to be directed at the joggers, as if the entity was deliberately frightening them, testing their reactions, possibly assessing them as potential prey. I presented my findings to my supervisor and to the Parks Authority. I recommended closing certain sections of Stanley Park until we could identify what we were dealing with. I argued that the creature posed a potential threat to public safety and that we needed to treat the situation with appropriate seriousness. My supervisor thought I was losing perspective. He suggested that I was becoming obsessed with the case, that I was seeing patterns in random animal sounds that didn't necessarily indicate anything unusual. He said that Stanley Park was home to a diverse ecosystem, and occasional unexpected vocalizations were to be expected. He recommended I take a step back and approach the situation more objectively. But I couldn't step back. The screaming was becoming more frequent. By April, reports were coming in almost daily. Joggers heard the terrifying sound. Residents living on the park's periphery reported it in the evenings. One night, a security guard said he heard it multiple times from different locations, as if the entity was moving through the park with purpose and intention. The number of reported sightings grew exponentially, and with it came the attention of the media. Local news stations picked up the story. The mysterious screamer of Stanley Park became a topic of conversation across Vancouver. Some people dismissed it as a hoax or mass hysteria. Others became genuinely frightened and began avoiding the park entirely. The Vancouver Parks Authority faced public pressure to explain what was happening and to ensure that visitors were safe. I was assigned to produce a comprehensive report. I worked for 3 weeks, compiling all the data, analyzing all the recordings, consulting with every expert I could find. And in the end, I had to write something I never thought I would write. I concluded that we were documenting vocalizations from an unidentified species, something that was not cataloged in any biological database, something that did not match the profile of any known animal in North America. The Parks Authority rejected my report. My supervisor said it was professionally irresponsible to suggest the existence of an unknown species based solely on audio recordings. He said that regardless of what the data showed, the scientific consensus was that all large animals in North America had been documented and cataloged. We couldn't have an unknown species making sounds in the middle of a major city. It was illogical, unscientific, and it would damage our credibility if we submitted such a report. Instead, he instructed me to conclude that the screaming was likely caused by a combination of known species, unusual acoustic phenomena, and possibly some human activity that was being misidentified. He told me to revise my report to reflect this more conventional explanation. I refused. I submitted my original report with my conclusions intact. And within 2 days, I was removed from the project. My supervisor said that I had become too emotionally invested in the case, that my judgment was compromised, and that I needed to take an extended leave of absence to recover my objectivity. I didn't accept the leave. I quit, but I couldn't stop investigating. The screamer had become an obsession, a mystery that demanded to be solved. I spent my own time and money continuing the research. I set up recording equipment in my own apartment, trying to detect patterns in the screaming that the Parks Authority had missed. I interviewed every jogger who reported hearing the sound. I studied everything I could find about unknown animals and cryptozoology, and I started hearing it myself. The first time was in early May, about 3 weeks after I'd been removed from the official investigation. I was jogging in Stanley Park early in the morning, around 6 o'clock, when the park was relatively empty. I was alone on the trail, surrounded by thick forest, and suddenly, I heard the scream. It was worse than the recordings had suggested. The sound had a quality that the audio equipment couldn't fully capture. It was primal, terrifying, something that reached down into the oldest parts of my brain and activated the fight or flight response. It was a scream of absolute anguish, absolute hunger, absolute rage. It was a sound that no human being should be able to make, and no animal should be able to produce. It was something in between, something that defied categorization. I ran. I didn't think about my scientific training or my desire to investigate further. I ran as hard as I could back toward the park entrance, and I didn't stop until I was in a populated area surrounded by other people. My heart was pounding. My legs were shaking, and I had the absolute certainty that if I hadn't run, if I stood there trying to get a closer look or a better recording, something terrible would have happened. That night, I began researching the history of Stanley Park. I dug through old newspaper archives, looking for any historical accounts of unusual animal activity or inexplicable sounds. And I found something that made my blood run cold. Going back over 100 years, there were sporadic reports of strange screaming in the park. Not frequent, but persistent. Joggers and hikers reporting terrifying sounds. Mysterious incidents where people were injured or disappeared. The reports were scattered and often dismissed, but the pattern was undeniable if you looked at the long history of the park. In 1952, a man named Arthur Pembroke disappeared while hiking in Stanley Park. He was found 3 days later, severely injured and unable to coherently describe what had happened to him. He died in the hospital without regaining consciousness. The official report said he'd fallen and struck his head on rocks, but his injuries didn't match a fall. The wounds looked like they'd been inflicted by something with claws, something that had torn at his body with deliberate violence. In 1967, a young couple reported being chased by something in the park. They described a tall, dark figure moving with impossible speed through the forest. They escaped to their car and drove away, but both of them reported hearing a scream behind them, a sound that was inhuman and absolutely terrifying. The police investigated but found no evidence of any creature or person in the park. There were other reports, spanning decades, all with the same general theme. Something in Stanley Park, something that screamed, something that hunted people. And now, in 2019, the screaming was starting again, more frequently and more intensely than ever before. I began keeping a detailed log of every scream I heard. The timing, the location, the intensity, the variations in pitch and frequency. And I realized something horrifying. The screamer was learning. Each scream was slightly different from the last, as if the entity was experimenting with different vocalizations, refining its ability to produce sounds, possibly even learning to mimic human speech patterns. In one recording from late May, the scream contained a fragment that sounded almost like a word. Not quite intelligible, but close enough to send a chill through my body when I heard it played back. By June, the screamer was becoming bolder. A jogger reported being followed by something invisible in the forest. She could hear it moving parallel to the trail, could hear the sound of something large moving through the dense undergrowth. And underneath the sounds of movement, she heard the screaming, but this time it seemed to contain intention, as if it was trying to communicate rather than just vocalize. Another jogger reported seeing a shadow moving between the trees. He described it as impossibly tall, impossibly thin, with a gait that was wrong, that didn't match any animal he'd ever seen. When he tried to get a better look, the shadow disappeared, and moments later, he heard the terrifying scream, but this time it came from directly above him, as if the entity was in the trees, looking down at him from above. I began to understand that the screamer was intelligent in a way that went beyond simple animal behavior. It was curious about humans. It was testing us. It was learning our patterns and our behaviors. And it was doing something that terrified me more than anything else. It was adapting to our presence. It was learning how to interact with us in increasingly sophisticated ways. In July, I made a decision that I now recognize was foolish and dangerous, but it was necessary if I was going to understand what we were dealing with. I decided to go into the forest at night and try to encounter the screamer directly. I brought audio recording equipment, thermal imaging cameras, and a satellite phone for emergencies. I wore thick clothing and brought a knife for protection, knowing all the while that if I actually encountered the entity, a knife would be as useless as a toothpick. But I needed to see it. I needed to understand what it was. I entered the forest at around 9 o'clock in the evening on July 16th. The park was closed to the public, and there were only a few security patrols that I knew I could avoid. I moved deeper into the interior, away from the trails, into the dense forest where the darkness was absolute and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. I was alone in the creepy darkness, and I knew it. I set up my equipment near a small clearing and waited. The night was utterly silent except for the ambient sounds of the forest. Insects, the occasional bird call, the wind through the trees, and then, after about an hour, I heard the screaming. It started far away, from somewhere deep in the forest. A single, long note, ascending in pitch, containing harmonics that made my teeth ache. Then it stopped, and silence returned. I waited, my hand on the thermal imaging camera, trying to get a reading on where the entity might be positioned. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Then the screaming resumed, this time closer, much closer, close enough that I could hear the breathiness underneath the sound. The physical effort required to produce a vocalization of that intensity. The entity was approaching me, slowly, deliberately, testing my reaction. I should have run. Every survival instinct in my body was screaming at me to leave, to get out of the forest, to get back to civilization and safety. But I was frozen by a combination of fear and fascination, unable to move, unable to do anything but wait for whatever was coming toward me to finally reveal itself. The screaming intensified. The entity was very close now, maybe only 50 yards away through the thick forest. I could hear movement in the undergrowth, the sound of something large moving with deliberate purpose. And then I saw it in the thermal imaging display. A shape, large, bipedal, standing upright in a way that nothing in the normal animal kingdom stood upright. It was looking directly at me, or at least it was oriented in my direction. And then it screamed, and the sound was so close, so loud, so utterly terrifying that my mind shut down for a moment. I dropped the thermal camera and ran. I didn't think about the equipment or the recordings or the research. I ran through the darkness, crashing through undergrowth, unable to see anything, guided only by the instinct to get away from that horrifying sound. Behind me, I could hear the entity following, its screams growing louder, more intense, more hunting-focused. It wasn't just vocalizing anymore. It was hunting me. I burst out of the forest near the park's edge and ran toward the nearest streetlight, toward civilization, toward other people. Behind me, the screaming stopped. The entity had stopped pursuing. It retreated back into the darkness of the forest, but not before I heard one final sound. A scream that contained something almost like laughter, a quality of dark amusement, as if the creature had been playing with me, testing my fear response, enjoying my terror. I didn't stop running until I was 6 blocks away from Stanley Park, surrounded by the lights and sounds of the city. I reported what I experienced to the park's authority and to the Vancouver Police Department. I described the entity in detail, gave them the location where I encountered it, and urged them to take immediate action to protect the public. The police launched an investigation, but they found nothing in the forest. No tracks, no evidence, no indication that any unusual animal was present in Stanley Park. The park's authority concluded that I had experienced a panic attack, possibly triggered by stress and obsessive behavior related to the Screamer case. They suggested that I seek psychological help and that I accept that the screaming sounds had rational explanations that didn't involve unknown creatures. But the screaming didn't stop. And more importantly, it changed. By August, reports of the screaming had multiplied dramatically. Joggers were hearing it multiple times per day. Residents in neighborhoods adjacent to the park were reporting the sounds at night. And most disturbingly, the screamer was becoming visible to people who encountered it. 3 separate joggers reported seeing a tall, dark figure in the forest, always at the periphery of vision, always disappearing when they tried to focus on it directly. A park security guard reported seeing something that looked almost human, but wrong in ways he couldn't articulate, moving through the trees at impossible speed. And then came the incident that changed everything. A woman named Sarah Chen was jogging alone in the park when she saw the figure. Unlike other joggers, Sarah didn't run. She stood her ground and tried to see it clearly. The entity stopped moving through the forest and seemed to regard her directly. Sarah described feeling a moment of absolute connection, a moment when she understood that the creature was intelligent, aware, and interested in her specifically. Then the screaming started, but this time, it didn't sound like rage or hunger. It sounded almost like an invitation. The creature walked partially out of the forest, revealing more of its form, showing itself to Sarah in a way it hadn't shown itself to anyone before. Sarah remembered nothing else. She was found by other joggers standing motionless on the trail, her eyes open but unseeing, unresponsive to stimuli. She was taken to the hospital in a catatonic state. She remained unresponsive for 3 days before she finally opened her eyes and tried to speak. But the words that came out of her mouth weren't her own. The voice was layered, containing multiple frequencies, multiple tones, just like the screaming. And the words it spoke were in no language anyone could identify. The doctors documented the sounds and sent them to linguistics experts around the world, but no one could determine what language she was speaking. After another day, the layered voice faded, and Sarah's own voice returned. But she had no memory of what had happened after she saw the figure in the forest. She had lost 3 days of her life, and she couldn't explain where she'd been or what she'd experienced. The incident shook me to my core. I realized that the screamer wasn't just an animal to be cataloged and studied. It was something intelligent, something aware, something that had its own agenda and its own purposes. And it seemed to be selecting specific people for some kind of interaction, some kind of communication that left them fundamentally changed. I also realized that I had been marked. Ever since the night I encountered it in the forest, I had been hearing the screaming inside my head, even when there was no external sound. At night, I would hear it in my dreams, calling to me, inviting me back to the park. During the day, I would find my thoughts drifting toward Stanley Park, toward the forest, toward the entity that had shown itself to me. I resisted the compulsion for 3 years. I moved away from Vancouver. I changed my career. I tried to build a normal life away from the coast and away from the darkness that Stanley Park contains. But the screaming never stops. It's always there, in the back of my mind, waiting, calling, inviting me to return. And the most terrifying part is that I can feel my resistance weakening. I know, with absolute certainty, that eventually I will return to Stanley Park. Eventually, I will walk back into that forest, and I will encounter the Screamer again. And when that happens, I'll understand what Sarah Chen experienced, what the entity wants from the people it selects. I'm writing this account as a warning and possibly as a goodbye. The Screamer of Stanley Park is real. It is intelligent, and it is actively selecting people for some purpose we don't yet understand. If you hear that high-pitched, terrifying scream echoing from the forest, dawn to try to get closer. Dawn to try to investigate. Dawn to try to see the figure in the trees. Run, and keep running until you are far away from that terrible darkness. Because if the Screamer decides to show itself to you directly, if you lock eyes with it and feel that moment of connection, you already lost. I can hear it now. Even as I write this, I can hear that eerie, chilling scream echoing in my mind. It is calling my name, and I know that soon, very soon, I'm going to answer. Story 3. Haunted Lighthouses of Prince Edward Island. I climbed 378 steps that should have been empty, and I wasn't alone. I knew I wasn't alone the moment I started ascending the spiral staircase of Wood Island's lighthouse on Prince Edward Island, because I could hear footsteps above me, footsteps that matched my pace perfectly, footsteps that belonged to something that couldn't possibly be there. My name is Captain James Mitchell, and for 15 years I served as a station commander with the Canadian Coast Guard, overseeing the lighthouse operations along Prince Edward Island, its eastern coast. I was trained in maritime safety protocols, emergency response, and the maintenance of critical navigational infrastructure. I was educated, rational, and skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained through logical analysis. But I was not prepared for what I encountered in those lighthouses, and I am releasing this account now because the Coast Guard has buried the truth, and someone needs to warn people about what really happens in those towers at night. The first incident occurred in September 2008. I was conducting a routine inspection of Wood Island's lighthouse, a structure that had been standing on that rocky point for over 140 years. The lighthouse was no longer staffed, having been automated in the 1970s. I was there alone, performing standard maintenance checks, documenting the condition of the equipment, making sure everything was functioning properly for the seasonal shipping traffic that moved through the area. The weather was deteriorating. Dark clouds were moving in from the Atlantic, and the wind was picking up, carrying with it the salt spray and the particular chill that you only feel when you are standing on a headland surrounded by water. I had climbed lighthouses hundreds of times before. There was nothing unusual about this visit, nothing that would have suggested anything was wrong. But as I ascended the spiral staircase, I began to notice something unsettling. I could hear breathing above me. Heavy breathing, the kind that comes from exertion. I could hear footsteps, moving at a steady pace, descending the stairs in what seemed like a clockwise pattern around the spiral. The footsteps were clear, distinct, the sound of something solid moving against the metal steps. I paused in my ascent and called out, announcing myself, asking if anyone else was in the tower. The footsteps stopped immediately. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the wind howling around the exterior of the lighthouse and the distant sound of the ocean. I waited for several minutes, listening, but there was no response. No voice, no further movement, just silence and the creepy sensation that something was watching me from the darkness above. I continued climbing, slowly, carefully, my hand on my radio in case I needed to call for backup. The steps seemed to go on forever. The curved walls pressed in on me, and the darkness grew heavier with each level one ascended. I could see through the small windows the landscape falling away below, the rocks and the spray, the isolation of this place, the way it stood alone on that headland, separated from everything, watching the horizon. When I reached the lantern room at the top of the lighthouse, there was nothing there. No person, no evidence that anyone had been present. But the air felt different, cooler, with a quality that suggested something had only recently left. And on the equipment console, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. The light was on. The automated light system was activated, fully powered, burning brightly despite the fact that it should have been dark. The system was controlled by a timer that switched the light on only at sunset and off at sunrise. I checked the clock. It was 2:47 in the afternoon. The light should have been completely off, the system dormant until evening. But there it was, burning in the daylight, the Fresnel lens rotating, casting its beam across the water in perfect mechanical rhythm. I immediately shut down the system and began a thorough inspection of the equipment. There was no sign of malfunction. The electronics were functioning perfectly. The only anomaly was that the light had been switched on manually, which was impossible because the manual controls were in the locked equipment room downstairs, a room I had not unlocked, a room that still had its original locks in place with dust around the keyhole suggesting they hadn't been used in years. I filed an incident report when I returned to the station. I documented the sounds I heard, the light being on, and my conclusion that either there was an electrical malfunction or someone had accessed the lighthouse without authorization. My supervisor reviewed the report and suggested the most likely explanation was a timer malfunction causing the light to activate prematurely. There was no evidence of break-in. There was no explanation for the footsteps I heard. So those were attributed to stress, to the natural creepiness of an old lighthouse, to my mind playing tricks on me in an isolated environment. I accepted that explanation. I wanted to accept that explanation. But I knew what I heard. 3 weeks later, I was sent back to Wood Islands to investigate a reported malfunction in the light system. The automated system had activated twice in broad daylight, both times without any explanation. This time, I wasn't alone. I brought a technician with me, a young man named Derek who worked on lighthouse systems for 5 years and had a reputation for being extremely pragmatic and skeptical. We inspected the equipment, ran diagnostic tests, and found absolutely nothing wrong. The system was functioning perfectly. There were no electrical faults, no timing issues, no software glitches. Derek was baffled. He said that based on every test he could run, the system was operating exactly as designed. Yet it had activated twice without any logical cause. We decided to wait in the lighthouse to see if we could observe the malfunction happening. We sat in the lantern room for 3 hours, monitoring the equipment, watching the afternoon light gradually fade as evening approached. As sunset neared, the system activated automatically, exactly on schedule, just as it was supposed to do. We made notes, checked the timer, confirmed everything was working properly. And then, at 7:33 in the evening, something happened that Derek couldn't rationalize away. The light suddenly brightened. The intensity of the beam increased dramatically, far beyond the normal output of the automated system. Derek immediately moved to the controls and began checking settings, looking for an explanation for the power surge. And this is when we both heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, climbing the stairs from the level below. They were coming up the spiral staircase, ascending toward our position with a steady, measured pace. Derek and I looked at each other, our eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. We both knew someone was climbing those stairs. We both knew we weren't imagining it. I called out, announcing that the lighthouse was restricted and that whoever was climbing needed to identify themselves immediately. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sound had been. The light returned to its normal intensity, and nothing else happened. Derek and I descended the stairs very quickly after that. We searched every level of the lighthouse. We checked every locked door, every sealed room, every space where someone could possibly hide. We found nothing, no person, no evidence of anyone being present. But the footsteps had been real. We both heard them. And the light surge had been real, documented on Derek's instruments as a temporary power increase that shouldn't have been possible given the system specifications. Derek was shaken. When we returned to the Coast Guard station, he submitted his report and requested that he never be assigned to lighthouse duty again. He said he didn't care what the rational explanation was. He knew what he heard, and he didn't want to go back into that tower. I reported the incident and once again faced institutional skepticism. My supervisor suggested that Derek and I had experienced some form of shared stress hallucination, or that there was someone trespassing in the lighthouse and we simply missed finding them. But there was no way someone could have been climbing those stairs without our hearing them throughout the entire ascent, and there was no way someone could have hidden from a thorough search of an enclosed structure. The reality that nobody wanted to acknowledge was that something impossible was happening in that lighthouse. But I couldn't let it go. Over the next several months, I conducted additional research into the history of Wood Island's lighthouse. I discovered historical records, newspaper articles, and Coast Guard documentation dating back over 100 years. And I found patterns, Reports of strange sounds in the lighthouse were documented as far back as 1887. Keepers had reported hearing footsteps when they were alone. Some reported seeing shadows moving through the lantern room. Others mentioned unexplained lights and sounds during the night, phenomena that had no rational explanation but were consistent with what Derek and I had experienced. In 1923, a lighthouse keeper named Thomas Harrow had abandoned his post suddenly, refusing to return to the lighthouse and claiming that he encountered something terrifying in the tower. He never elaborated on what he'd seen, but he left the service and moved inland, away from the coast. He lived the rest of his life in a small inland town, far from the ocean, and according to records, he rarely left his house. In 1956, another keeper had attempted to document what he was experiencing in the lighthouse. His journal entries described a presence, something intelligent that moved through the tower at night, something that manifested as footsteps and unexplained sounds. The journal ended abruptly. The keeper quit his position days after the final entry. The pattern was undeniable. Something in that lighthouse had been documented for over a century, something that terrified people enough to make them abandon their careers, something that existed outside the boundaries of rational explanation. I began investigating the other lighthouses along the Bay Coast. I conducted inspections at Souris East Lighthouse, Point Prim Lighthouse, and East Point Lighthouse. At each location, I found similar histories of strange phenomena. At Souris East, residents in nearby towns reported seeing lights in the tower when it should have been unattended and unmanned. At Point Prim, the last permanent keeper had left behind a logbook documenting eerie sounds and phantom footsteps, entries that became increasingly erratic and disturbed as the weeks went on, until the entries abruptly stopped and the keeper abandoned his post. At East Point Lighthouse, I found something more disturbing. I discovered documentation of a keeper named William Patrick who had been stationed there in 1891. According to official records, William had fallen from the lighthouse lantern room and died in the fall. The investigation concluded it was an accident, possibly caused by slipping on the narrow catwalk. But there were irregularities in the report. The catwalk had railings that should have prevented an accidental fall, and the investigation notes mentioned something odd. The examining physician had noted in his autopsy report that William's body bore marks consistent with being struck repeatedly, marks that couldn't have come from a simple fall. The official report concluded it was an accident, but the evidence suggested something very different. I began to formulate a theory, a hypothesis that terrified me because I knew how it would be received by the medical and scientific establishment. The lighthouses were haunted, not in the sense of ghosts or spirits, but by something intelligent, something that existed in those towers, something that manifested as footsteps and sounds and unexplained phenomena. And whatever it was dangerous. I shared my theory with my supervisor, and it was the biggest mistake of my career. He listened patiently, heard my evidence, reviewed the historical documentation, and then informed me that I was experiencing burnout and obsessive thinking patterns. He ordered me to take a leave of absence. He said that my preoccupation with the lighthouse phenomena was affecting my judgment, that I was seeing patterns where none existed, and that I needed to step back and regain perspective. I was sent home on mandatory medical leave, told to take medications for anxiety that I didn't need, and informed that my position as station commander was being reassigned. Within 3 months, my career was over. I was medically discharged from the Coast Guard, my service record carefully annotated with references to stress-related illness and psychological concerns. The institution had decided that it was safer to eliminate the person reporting the problem than to acknowledge the problem itself. But the phenomena didn't stop. Even after I was discharged, I continued receiving reports from current and former Coast Guard personnel. Some contacted me unofficially, sharing their own experiences in the lighthouses, confirming that what I documented was real. They told me about the terrifying sounds they heard, the inexplicable lights, the overwhelming sense of a presence in those towers. One retired keeper contacted me in 2011, years after the initial incidents. He described his experience at East Point Lighthouse in graphic detail. He said that during his final night on duty, he had heard something descending the spiral staircase, something heavy and deliberate, something that moved with purpose. He attempted to leave the lighthouse, but when he reached the bottom of the staircase, he found the exit door locked from the outside. Someone or something had locked him in. He spent the night trapped in that lighthouse, listening to the sounds above him, to the footsteps moving through the lantern room, to a presence that he could feel observing him, studying him. By morning, the door was no longer locked. He walked out without looking back and had left the Coast Guard that same day. He told me something that connected all the incidents into a coherent, horrifying narrative. He said that the presence in the lighthouses seemed to be learning. The footsteps were becoming more defined, more purposeful. The manifestations were becoming more frequent and more intense. It was as if whatever inhabited those towers was becoming stronger, more capable of interacting with our world, more able to affect physical reality. And he told me something else, something that has haunted me every day since. He said that he believed the presence was spreading, that it wasn't limited to just the lighthouses. That similar phenomena had been reported at lighthouses up and down the Atlantic coast, at isolated structures where the barriers between our world and whatever lies beyond seemed particularly thin. They spent the last several years researching historical lighthouse incidents across North America and beyond. They found documentation of strange phenomena at lighthouses from Maine to California, from the Great Lakes to the Pacific Northwest. They found accounts of keepers abandoning their posts, unexplained deaths, and mysterious footsteps in towers that should be empty. And they come to a terrifying conclusion. The lighthouses are connected. They were not isolated incidents of paranormal activity. They are part of a larger phenomenon, a network of locations where something is manifesting, something that exists on the boundary between our reality and something else. The lighthouses, standing alone on headlands and rocky points, separated from civilization, exist in a kind of liminal space. And that liminal space is becoming a gateway. What is coming through that gateway is learning. It is becoming more capable each year. It is manifesting with greater frequency and greater clarity. And it is selecting people, testing them, interacting with them in ways that are becoming increasingly direct and increasingly dangerous. I know this because I can still hear the footsteps. Even now, years after my discharge, even living far inland, away from any lighthouse, I can hear those phantom footsteps in my dreams. They reclimbing stairs, descending into darkness, moving through empty towers. And sometimes I wake up and I'm not entirely certain where I am, not entirely convinced that I am actually in my home and not in some lighthouse tower somewhere, listening to something move in the darkness above me. I'm writing this account as a final confession, a final attempt to warn people about what is happening in those lighthouses. The Coast Guard will deny it. The government will cover it up. The scientific establishment will dismiss it as psychological disorder. But the truth remains. The lighthouses of Prince Edward Island are haunted. The other lighthouses along the coasts are haunted. And whatever is haunting them is becoming stronger, becoming more present, becoming increasingly capable of manifesting in our world. If you ever find yourself in a lighthouse at night, if you ever hear footsteps when you alone, if you ever see lights turning on in towers that should be dark, then you need to leave immediately. Dawn, to try to investigate. Dawn, to try to see what is there. Because whatever is climbing those stairs, whatever is moving through that darkness, it is interested in you. And once they heard those footsteps, once they made contact with the presence in those towers, you can never fully escape the knowledge of what exists in those eerie, isolated places. The footsteps are still following me. I can hear them every night, echoing in my mind, reminding me of what I discovered, reminding me that something real and terrifying is waiting in those lighthouses, waiting in that darkness, waiting for the moment when the barriers grow thin enough for it to step completely into our world. And when that moment comes, the lighthouses to be the only places where the horror manifests. Story 4, British Columbia, as Highway of Tears, the unreported encounters. I was picked up by a man with black eyes on Highway 16 between Terrace and Prince Rupert, and I should have died that night. The fact that I didn't, it might be the most terrifying part of the entire experience. My name is Patricia Owens, and I am releasing this account after 23 years of silence because the official investigations into the Highway of Tears disappearances have failed to identify the real pattern. They blamed serial killers and drifters. They focused on the murders that are documented and solved, but they missed the crucial detail that would explain the cases that remain unsolved, the disappearances that have no body, no evidence, nothing but a victim who vanishes into darkness and is never seen again. I was 18 years old in the autumn of 2001. I was hitchhiking from Prince George to Terrace, trying to get home after a summer job at a logging camp. I was young and naive, the kind of person who thought bad things only happened to other people, That danger was something that happened in cities, not along empty highways in rural British Columbia. I'd been hitchhiking since I was 15, had done it hundreds of times without incident. So I wasn't thinking about the danger when I saw the dark sedan pull over on the shoulder ahead of me. The driver rolled down his window, and I approached the car without hesitation. He was a man of indeterminate age, maybe 30, maybe 50, with features that were blurred somehow, as if my eyes couldn't quite focus on his face. What I noticed most clearly were his eyes. They were completely black, not dark brown, but absolutely black, like looking into empty space, like something that was dark and vast and utterly without light existed behind those eyes. I remember hesitation. I remember a moment where my instincts screamed that something was wrong, that I shouldn't get in this car. But he already opened the passenger door, and he was asking me where I was headed, speaking in a voice that was perfectly normal, perfectly reasonable, perfectly unremarkable. And then he smiled. His mouth opened, and when he smiled, I could see his teeth, and they were wrong. Too long, too pointed. The smile lasted for only an instant before his expression returned to normal. But I'd seen it. I'd seen something that shouldn't exist, something that wore a human face, but that was fundamentally other. I stepped back from the car. I told him I'd changed my mind, that I was going to wait for a different ride. Something in my voice must have conveyed my fear, because his expression shifted. The man with black eyes studied me for a moment, and I felt the weight of his attention, the sense that he was assessing me, calculating something, determining whether I was a threat or an opportunity. Then he nodded slightly, as if he reached a decision. He told me I was making the right choice. He said that some people were easy prey, but I had something in me that made me hard to take. He said I should remember this moment, should remember what I'd seen, because it would save my life someday. And then he rolled up his window and drove away, disappearing into the darkness of the highway. I stood on that roadside for a long time after he left, shaking, trying to process what had happened. I told myself I imagined the teeth. I told myself my fear had distorted my perception of his eyes. I told myself it had been a normal encounter with a strange person. Nothing more. But I knew what I'd seen. I waited for the next vehicle, a logging truck driven by an older man who was completely ordinary, completely safe. I got in and didn't say anything about the car that had picked me up before him. I arrived in Terrace the next morning, and I tried to forget the encounter entirely. But I couldn't forget. The image of those black eyes and those pointed teeth remained burned into my memory, returning in nightmares, haunting me with the certainty that I encountered something that shouldn't exist on Highway 16. 2 weeks later, I saw a missing person poster. The poster featured a photograph of a young woman named Sarah Blackwood, age 19, who had disappeared while hitchhiking on Highway 16 between Prince George and Terrace. The disappearance had occurred on the same day I'd been hitchhiking, probably around the same time I encountered the man with black eyes. Sarah had been reported missing when she didn't arrive at her destination, but she was never found. I thought about reporting what I'd seen to the police, but I knew how it would sound. I couldn't describe the man's face accurately because my eyes seemed to slide off his features. I couldn't explain why his teeth had looked wrong without sounding insane. I had no license plate number, no solid description, nothing but a vague memory of a dark sedan and the overwhelming certainty that the driver was something other than human. So I stayed silent, but I became obsessed with the Highway of Tears disappearances. I collected newspaper articles, researched the cases, tried to find patterns in the missing persons reports. And I discovered something horrifying. The disappearances fell into two categories. There were the documented murders, cases where bodies were found, where evidence was collected, where killers were identified and convicted. These cases received attention from law enforcement and the media. But there were other disappearances, cases where people simply vanished without a trace, where no body was ever recovered, where the circumstances suggested something completely different from typical criminal activity. In these unexplained cases, survivors who had been in the vehicles with the victims reported the same thing. They described a driver with black eyes. They described features that seemed somehow wrong, impossible to focus on clearly. Some described teeth that were too long or too sharp. Some described a smile that contained something predatory and other. And all of them reported an overwhelming sense that whatever was driving the vehicle was not human. The police had dismissed these accounts. They attributed the descriptions to trauma and stress, to the way memory distorts under extreme fear. But as I collected more and more accounts, the consistency of the descriptions became undeniable. Too many survivors were describing the same impossible thing to be explained away as coincidence or psychological distortion. I began corresponding with other survivors, building a network of people who had encountered the man with black eyes and lived to tell about it. I spoke with a woman named Linda who had been picked up by the sedan in 1994. She'd been in the vehicle with her boyfriend, and they both noticed the driver's eyes immediately. The driver had seemed normal at first, engaging in ordinary conversation. But after they'd been driving for a while, the atmosphere in the car had changed. The driver had started asking strange questions about their deepest fears, their worst nightmares, the things that terrified them most. He asked these questions in a calm, conversational tone. But the questions were deeply probing, deeply invasive, designed to access their most intimate thoughts. Linda's boyfriend had become uncomfortable and asked to be let out. The driver had pulled over and let him exit the vehicle, but Linda found herself unable to leave. The driver had turned to her and told her that she should stay in the car, that he had more questions for her, that she was interesting in a way that her boyfriend wasn't. She managed to unbuckle her seatbelt and run from the vehicle. She escaped into the forest and eventually found her way to a small logging road where a truck driver found her hours later. But she never recovered from the experience. She spent the rest of her life dealing with the knowledge that she'd been selected, that something had determined her to be interesting or suitable for something. I spoke with another survivor named Marcus, a man who had been picked up in 1997. He'd seen the same black eyes, the same unsettling features. The driver had asked him about his darkest thoughts, his violent impulses, the parts of himself he'd hidden from everyone else. Marcus described the experience as psychologically invasive, as if the driver was rummaging through his mind, accessing thoughts that he'd never spoken aloud. When Marcus had asked the driver to let him out, the driver had complied immediately. But before Marcus left the car, the driver had told him something that had haunted him ever since. He said that Marcus had something inside him that needed to come out, something dark and violent that was going to hurt people someday. He said he'd been hoping Marcus would be interesting enough to take with him, but that Marcus was too damaged, too unstable, too likely to struggle. Marcus had spent the next 2 decades wondering if the driver had been correct, if there really was something dark in his nature that was going to eventually manifest in violent action. As I collected more accounts, a terrifying pattern emerged. The driver seemed to be hunting for specific types of people. He was drawn to young people, to those who were isolated and vulnerable, to those who were hitchhiking alone or with only one companion. But he wasn't just hunting for prey. He seemed to be conducting some form of assessment, evaluating people against criteria that existed only in his own alien mind. And the people who disappeared were always the ones who seemed to interest him most. I discovered that the disappearances on Highway 16 had been occurring at a consistent rate for at least 40 years. Some years there were more disappearances than others, but the pattern was relentless. Young people, mostly Indigenous women and women of color, people from marginalized communities whose disappearances didn't always receive media attention or serious investigation. And underneath all of these cases was the consistent report from survivors who escaped. A driver with black eyes, a vehicle that appeared normal but felt fundamentally wrong inside, questions about fear and darkness and the most private thoughts, an assessment process that determined whether someone was suitable for whatever the driver's ultimate purpose was. I began to formulate a hypothesis that terrified me. A theory about what was actually hunting people on Highway 16. The driver with black eyes wasn't human. The reports of impossible features, the black eyes, the pointed teeth, the way his face was difficult to focus on, all of it suggested something that was using a human form as a disguise, but that was fundamentally alien, fundamentally other. It was an entity that had learned to drive vehicles and wear human clothes, that could communicate in human language and ask human questions, but that was operating according to alien imperatives and alien hunger. And it was selecting people, taking them somewhere, for some purpose that involved their psychological darkness and their capacity for fear. I researched what survivors described as the interior of the car. Those who escaped all reported that the inside of the vehicle felt larger than it should be, that the space seemed to extend further back than the physical dimensions of the car should allow. Some reported hearing sounds coming from the trunk or from beneath the car, sounds that suggested other people were present, people who were restrained or imprisoned. The vehicle was being used to transport prey. The question that haunted me was whether there was actually a physical vehicle or if the car was itself some kind of entity. Something that appeared to be a sedan but was actually a living thing, a creature that had learned to mimic human vehicles to lure its victims. I attempted to report my findings to the RCMP. I compiled all my evidence, all the survivor testimonies, all the pattern analysis, and I contacted a homicide detective working the Highway of Tears cases. He listened to my theory and was polite, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. He said that while the pattern of survivors describing similar features was interesting, it was far more likely that the descriptions were contaminated by prior knowledge, that the survivors had heard about other cases and had unconsciously incorporated those details into their own memories. He told me that the Highway of Tears disappearances were tragic, but they were explainable through known criminal activity. There was no evidence of anything supernatural or exotic. The reasonable explanation was that there were predators operating in the area, and law enforcement was working hard to identify and apprehend them. He didn't want to acknowledge what I was describing because it didn't fit into any category that law enforcement could respond to. So the truth remained buried. But the disappearances continued. Every year, more young people vanished along Highway 16. Every year, the pattern repeated itself, with some survivors escaping and reporting the man with black eyes, and others never being found at all. The official investigation continued to focus on conventional criminals, missing the real horror that was hunting people on that stretch of road. I've spent the last 23 years trying to warn people. They created a website documenting the accounts of survivors. They've given interviews to researchers studying paranormal phenomena. They attempted to reach out to indigenous communities who have been disproportionately affected by the disappearances. And they continued collecting accounts from new survivors, people who encounter the sedan and manage to escape. The accounts remain consistent. The driver always has black eyes. The vehicle always feels wrong inside, larger than it should be, with sounds coming from hidden compartments. The driver always asks probing questions about fear and darkness, and the driver always makes some determination about whether the passenger is suitable for whatever happens next. Those who are determined to be unsuitable are released unharmed. Those who are determined to be suitable disappear into whatever place the vehicle takes them. I believe that the driver is still hunting. I believe that the sedan is still moving up and down Highway 16, selecting victims, assessing their psychological profiles, taking those who meet its alien criteria. I believe that there are dozens, possibly hundreds of people who have vanished into that vehicle and have never been found. People who exist in whatever space exists inside that car. People who are no longer on this earth but who are no longer dead either. And I believe that the driver is becoming more sophisticated, more capable of passing as human, more efficient at selecting victims. The disappearances seem to be accelerating. The pattern is becoming more defined. It is as if the entity is no longer content to hunt passively along the highway, but is actively seeking prey with increasing boldness. I'm writing this final account because I realized something disturbing about my own experience. The driver let me go not because I had something that made me hard to take, but because I was already marked. He was observing me, collecting my psychological profile, determining whether I would be valuable to his hunting grounds. And he decided that I needed to remain alive, needed to see him, needed to survive the encounter so that I would spread the knowledge of his existence, so that more potential prey would learn to be afraid, would learn to recognize the sign of his presence. He used me to make his hunting grounds scarier, to infuse Highway 16 with the knowledge that something impossible was hunting there. And in doing so, he made that highway more appealing to the kinds of prey he was seeking. The people with the deepest fears, the darkest thoughts, the most intense psychological damage. I become his accomplice. Every time I warn someone, every time I spread the story of the man with black eyes, I'm making the highway more dangerous, making it a place where fear and darkness accumulate, making it more attractive to the entity that hunts there. And now I can feel him watching me. I see dark sedans everywhere, parked on streets, following me on highways, always just at the edge of my vision. I hear sounds in the night that seem almost like an engine idling, almost like the hum of a vehicle waiting. I feel the weight of black eyes observing me from just beyond the boundaries of perception. The driver told me I would remember this moment, that it would save my life someday. But I think he lied. I think he was choosing me for something, marking me for a purpose I don't yet understand. And I think eventually, when he determines that they adequately fulfilled that purpose, when They scared enough people that the fear accumulates into a tangible presence on Highway 16. He'll come back. He'll pull that dark sedan up alongside me. He'll open the passenger door. And this time I want to be able to refuse his invitation. If you rereading this and you recognize yourself in these accounts, if they've been picked up by a driver with impossible black eyes, if you remember a vehicle that felt wrong and a driver that asked you terrifying questions, then you need to understand something. You were not safe just because you escaped. The entity that hunts Highway 16 doesn't forget its prey. It assesses you, marks you, and waits for the moment when your defenses are weakest, when your fear is greatest, when the time is right to complete what it started. Highway 16 is haunted, and the thing that haunts it wears a human face and drives a dark sedan, and it is still hunting, still selecting, still taking people into whatever darkness exists inside that impossible vehicle. And someday, it is coming back for me. Story 5, Quebec Forest Siren Recordings. The voice on my recording sounds exactly like a woman crying for help in the darkness, except when you run it through audio analysis software, the frequency pattern registers as something that has never come from a human throat. I was the camper who captured those terrifying sounds deep in the Quebec wilderness. And what happened during those 3 nights in the forest changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in the woods. This is my confession about the siren of Parc National de la Mauricie, and why I'll never go camping again. The recordings have been analyzed by 3 separate biologists, 2 acoustic specialists, and a team from McGill University. Every single one reached the same disturbing conclusion. Whatever made those sounds was mimicking human speech, but the underlying structure is wrong. Impossible. The vocal range extends into frequencies that human vocal cords cannot produce. The pitch modulation follows patterns found in predator species, not primates. It sounds human, but it absolutely is not. I went into those woods with my brother-in-law Jake last September, looking for a quiet weekend away from the stress of work and family obligations. We both experienced outdoorsmen, familiar with the forests of Quebec. We knew about bears, knew about moose, knew how to handle ourselves in the wilderness. What we didn't know was that something else lived in those trees. Something that had been luring people deeper into the forest for decades. We set up camp about 8 miles from the nearest trailhead, in a small clearing beside a stream that fed into Lac Wapazaganki. Beautiful spot, dense spruce and birch surrounding us on all sides. The kind of isolation you can only find in the deep Canadian wilderness. Perfect silence except for the water and the birds. We spent the first day fishing and exploring, enjoying the peace. That night, around 10 o'clock, we heard her for the first time. A woman's voice calling from somewhere in the trees to the north. Faint but clear, she was calling for help, saying she was lost, asking if anyone could hear her. Her voice sounded desperate, frightened, exactly like someone in genuine distress. Jake and I grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the sound. We were not the kind of men who ignore someone in trouble. We called out, letting her know we were coming. She responded, her voice seeming to move through the trees, always just ahead of us. We followed for maybe 20 minutes, pushing through underbrush, climbing over fallen logs, moving deeper into the forest. Then Jake stopped suddenly. He pointed at his GPS unit. We'd been walking in a perfect circle. According to the coordinates, we were heading back toward our camp from the opposite direction. But the voice was still ahead of us, still calling for help, still sounding desperate and human and real. That is when the fear started. That cold, creeping realization that something was wrong. The voice called again, and this time I really listened. The words were right. The emotional tone was convincing. But underneath, there was something off. A quality I couldn't quite identify. Like listening to a recording that has been compressed too many times. All the surface details intact, but the deeper authenticity missing. We returned to camp without finding anyone. Convinced ourselves it was an echo effect. Sound bouncing strangely off the lake and the valley walls. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd been lured. Deliberately led in circles by something that wanted us away from the safety of our camp. I decided to record the next occurrence. Set my phone on a stand with the audio app running. If we heard the voice again, I did have proof. Documentation. Something to analyze in the morning when we had better perspective. The voice returned at 2:30 in the morning. I was awake instantly, listening to her call from the darkness. This time she said she was hurt. That something had attacked her. She begged for help, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine pain and terror. Jake sat up in his sleeping bag, reaching for his boots. But I stopped him, made him listen with me instead of running toward it. We stayed in the tent, the voice calling for nearly 40 minutes. And as we listened, not moving, not responding, the tone began to change. The desperation became anger. The pleading became demanding. The voice grew louder, closer, until it sounded like someone was standing just outside our tent. And then we heard something that made my blood freeze. The voice split. What had been one voice calling became two. Two identical voices speaking in perfect unison, saying the exact same words with the exact same inflection. But no two humans can synchronize speech that perfectly. It's neurologically impossible. Even trained performers have microsecond delays. But these voices were identical, overlapping, like one sound source producing a doubled effect. Then the voices diverged. One continued calling for help while the other started laughing. Not cruel laughter or mocking laughter, just laughing, like it had given up the pretense and was enjoying itself. The contrast was horrifying, a desperate plea for help mixed with cheerful laughter, both in the same female voice, both coming from what sounded like the same location in the darkness beyond our tent. Jake whispered that we should leave, pack up immediately and hike out even though it was the middle of the night. But I refused. Moving through the forest in darkness, disoriented and frightened, was exactly what this thing wanted. Whatever was out there, it was trying to separate us from safety, draw us away from light and shelter and into the trees where it had the advantage. We stayed in the tent, not moving, barely breathing. The voices continued for another hour, sometimes calling for help, sometimes laughing, sometimes speaking in what sounded like French, though I don't speak French well enough to know if the words were real or just phonetic mimicry. And then, around 4 a.m, it stopped. Complete silence. Even the normal forest sounds were gone. No insects, no animals, just absolute, suffocating quiet. At first light we emerged from the tent. The clearing looked undisturbed. No footprints, no signs that anyone had been near our camp. But I noticed something strange. The trees on the northern edge of the clearing, where the voices had originated, were marked. Long scratches in the bark, high up, maybe 8 or 9 feet off the ground. Fresh scratches that hadn't been there the previous day. I examined them closely. They looked like claw marks. 4 parallel grooves scored deep into the wood, but the spacing was wrong. Too wide for a bear, too deep for any animal I knew. And they were on multiple trees, all at the same height, forming a rough line that curved around the northern perimeter of our camp. Like something had marked territory, or left a warning. We should have packed up and left right then. But stubborn, stupid. I wanted to understand what we encountered, wanted proof. So I convinced Jake to stay one more night, to set up multiple recording devices around the perimeter, to document whatever came back. That second night, we got more than documentation. We got evidence of something that should not exist. I placed 4 phones around the clearing, all recording audio. 1 north, 1 south, 1 east, 1 west. All time synced, all running the same recording software. The plan was to triangulate the sound source, figure out exactly where the voice was coming from and whether it was moving. The voice returned at midnight, and this time, when I listened to the playback later, I understood the true horror of what we encountered. All 4 recordings captured the voice clearly, but according to the timestamps and audio analysis, the voice was coming from all 4 directions simultaneously. Not echo, not reverberation, 4 distinct sound sources, all producing the exact same voice at the exact same moment. It was impossible. No single creature could produce sound from 4 locations at once, and the voice moved. Throughout the night, the pattern shifted. Sometimes all 4 recordings picked it up, sometimes only 2 or 3. It circled our camp, staying just beyond the light of our fire, calling and laughing and sometimes making sounds that weren't words at all. Clicking, chittering, noises that seemed designed to test our reaction, to gauge what sounds would make us leave the safety of our tent. Around 2 a.m, it tried something new. The voice changed. It became Jake, his wife Sarah. Called his name, told him she was lost in the woods. She'd come looking for us and gotten turned around. She needed him, begged him to help her find her way back. Jake, his face went pale. He grabbed his phone and called Sarah. She answered from their home 3 hours away, safe and confused about why he was calling so late. But outside our tent, the voice that sounded exactly like her continued pleading for help. Perfect mimicry, perfect emotional manipulation. If Jake hadn't been able to verify his wife's location, he might have run into those dark trees searching for her. That It's when I truly understood what this thing was. It wasn't just making sounds. It was learning, adapting, trying different strategies to lure us away from safety. It had started with generic calls for help. When those failed, it added emotional manipulation. When that didn't work, it tried to impersonate someone we cared about. This was intelligent, calculated, predatory. The night wore on. The voices continued. And gradually, as my fear turned to fascination, I began to notice more details in the recordings. The breath sounds were wrong. Too regular, too mechanical. When the voice paused, there was no natural break in the pattern. No variation in rhythm that comes from real respiration. It was like listening to a perfect loop, sound produced by something that didn't breathe. And there were other sounds in the background. If you amplified the quiet moments between the words, you could hear something moving through the underbrush. Something large, but the movement was wrong too. No cracking branches, no rustling leaves, just a smooth, sliding sound, like something dragging itself across the forest floor. I made a decision that might have saved our lives. I started playing the recordings back, broadcasting them from my portable speaker, fighting mimicry with mimicry. If this thing was using sound to hunt, maybe sound could be used to confuse it. The voices outside stopped immediately. Complete silence. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, they started again, but different, confused. The perfect synchronization broke. The voices became discordant, overlapping awkwardly, like the thing couldn't process hearing its own sounds reflected back. For the first time, it sounded uncertain. We kept playing the recordings, looping them, filling the night with echoes of the thing, his own voice. And slowly, over the course of an hour, the voices outside retreated, growing fainter, moving deeper into the forest, until finally, blessedly, they were gone. We didn't sleep. We maintained the audio playback all night, creating a barrier of recorded sound around our camp. At dawn, we packed everything and hiked out, fast, not stopping until we reached the parking area and the safety of our truck. I took the recordings to a biologist friend at the University of Montreal. She was skeptical at first, thought I was pranking her, but when she analyzed the audio, her expression changed. She ran the files through specialized software designed to identify animal vocalizations. Nothing matched. The frequency patterns didn't correspond to any known species. The vocal range was beyond human capability but didn't match any documented animal either. She sent the files to a colleague who specialized in bioacoustics. He reached the same conclusion. Whatever produced those sounds was unlike anything in the scientific literature. He noted that the pitch modulation and frequency patterns showed characteristics of predator species. Specifically, sounds designed to elicit prey response, but adapted, modified, refined to target human psychology specifically. He said, off the record, that if these recordings were genuine, they represented something science didn't know existed. Something that had evolved or adapted to hunt humans using acoustic manipulation. A predator that used our own instincts against us. Our drive to help others. Our emotional bonds. Our fear and uncertainty. I filed a report with park authorities. They were polite but dismissive. Said I had probably heard coyotes or owls. Maybe a loon, which can produce eerily human-like sounds. They refused to acknowledge that anything unusual had occurred. But I learned later that our experience wasn't unique. Over the past 20 years, 14 hikers have gone missing in Parc National de la Mauricie. All experienced outdoors people. All disappeared without a trace. Their campsites found abandoned but undisturbed. And in at least 6 cases, other campers reported hearing voices calling from the forest in the nights before the disappearances. Voices asking for help. Voices of people they knew. Voices that led them away from safety and into the trees. The park never closed, never issued warnings, because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting something impossible, that the Quebec wilderness harbors something that hunts with sound. Something that can mimic human voices with perfect accuracy. Something intelligent enough to adapt its tactics based on prey response. I don't know what it is. The biologists can, to explain it. But I have theories. Perhaps it is a species we haven't documented. Something rare and elusive that has learned to exploit human behavior. Or maybe it is something older, something from indigenous legends that dismissed as myth. The Wendigo, the Skinwalker, whatever name you give it, the reality is the same. Something lives in those forests. Something that calls to you in voices you trust. And if you follow those voices into the darkness, you dawn to come back. The recordings are online now, uploaded to multiple sites. Audio experts and enthusiasts have analyzed them. The consensus is clear. The sounds are real. The analysis is accurate. Whatever made those voices is not human and not any known animal. It's something else entirely. Something that should not exist but does. I am sharing this story as a warning. If you camping in the Quebec wilderness or any deep forest and you hear someone calling for help in the night, be very, very careful. Record it if you can. Done to approach alone. And if the voice sounds too perfect, too consistent, too emotional, done to trust it. Because you might be hearing the siren, and once it knows you, re-listening, once it learns your voice and the voices of the people you love, it will use that knowledge to hunt you. The forest is full of dangers, bears, weather, getting lost. But the worst danger is the one that sounds like salvation. The voice offering help when you need it most. The familiar sound that draws you deeper into darkness. That is the horror that waits in the Quebec woods. That is the nightmare I survived. And the recordings prove it. It's real. Story 6. Edmonton Bridge Shadow That Pushes. I felt invisible hands push me toward the railing of the high-level bridge in Edmonton. And I have no explanation for how I survived that encounter or why the authorities have completely buried the evidence of what is actually happening on that bridge. My name is Thomas Wendell, and I am releasing this account because the official investigation into the suicide attempts on the high-level bridge has reached conclusions that contradict the physical evidence. And I believe people need to know the truth about what I experienced that night in March 2016 and what my research has since revealed about the bridge. It's horrifying history. I was 34 years old and walking across the high-level bridge on a Tuesday evening. It was around 6:15 in the evening, dusk falling over Edmonton, the city lights beginning to flicker on below. The bridge was relatively empty, just a few other pedestrians scattered along its length, joggers and people on their way home from work. I was walking from the east side toward downtown, taking the scenic route, enjoying the cool spring air after a long day at the office. I had no intention of being anywhere but exactly where I was. I had no suicidal ideation. I had nothing but a desire to clear my head and get home. The temperature dropped suddenly, not gradually, but all at once, as if I passed through an invisible barrier from spring into the depths of winter. My breath came out in white clouds, and my skin crawled with the sensation of being observed, studied, focused upon with an intensity that made every nerve in my body activate the fight or flight response. I stopped walking and looked around. There was nothing visible, no person, no obvious source for the cold. But I could feel something, a presence just outside the periphery of my vision, something that was utterly terrifying in its invisibility. It was as if something stood beside me on the bridge, something large and dark and aware, something that was looking at me with an attention that had weight and substance. I felt a hand on my back, not pushing, not yet, just touching, as if assessing my weight, my stability, my ability to resist. The hand was cold, numbingly cold, with a texture that felt like fabric or perhaps skin that had been exposed to extreme temperatures for an extended period. The fingers were long, articulate, impossibly precise in the way they registered my physical form. I moved away immediately, stepping toward the center of the bridge, away from the railing. I told myself I imagined the contact, that my mind was playing tricks on me, that the cold snap had triggered some kind of panic response. But I knew what I felt. I knew that something had actually touched me. The presence moved with me. I could feel it just beyond my direct perception, moving at the same pace, maintaining the same distance, a dark shape in the corner of my vision that would disappear the moment I tried to focus on it. And then it happened. I felt pressure against my body, pressure that was pushing me, deliberately and with considerable force, toward the railing of the bridge. The pushing was relentless, methodical, as if something was determined to move me closer to the edge. I resisted, pushing back against the invisible force, struggling to maintain my position on the bridge, this walkway. I was losing. Whatever was pushing me was stronger than I was, more determined, more focused. I was being moved toward the railing inch by inch, my feet sliding on the concrete, my hands grasping at nothing, unable to find purchase, unable to stop the inexorable movement toward the edge. I screamed. I remember making the conscious decision to scream, but the sound came out of me, a cry of absolute terror that echoed across the bridge. The pushing stopped immediately. The presence vanished as if it had never been there, and I fell forward onto the bridge, this walkway, gasping, trembling, unable to process what had just happened. Other pedestrians came running toward me, asking if I was okay, if I needed help. I couldn't explain what had happened. I couldn't articulate the experience in a way that would make sense to them. So I told them I tripped, that I lost my footing, that I was fine. They seemed skeptical but accepted my explanation and went on their way. I remained on the bridge for several more minutes, sitting on the concrete, my heart racing, my mind struggling to categorize what I experienced. I knew I hadn't hallucinated. I knew I hadn't imagined the contact or the pressure. Something had actually touched me, and something had actually attempted to push me off the bridge. When I finally stabilized enough to move, I walked quickly toward the end of the bridge and descended into the city. I took a taxi home, and I didn't speak about the experience to anyone. I told myself that if I didn't talk about it, if I didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would feel less real. But it didn't feel less real. It felt more real with each passing day. 3 weeks later, I was walking the same bridge again, same route, same time of evening. I convinced myself that the first experience had been anomalous, an isolated incident, something that wouldn't happen again. I was trying to reclaim that space, to assert my normalcy, to prove to myself that I could exist on the bridge without terror. The cold came again at the same location. This time, I was prepared, or I thought I was prepared. The moment I felt the temperature drop and the presence manifest, I began moving away from the railing toward the center of the bridge. But the entity was waiting for me. It had anticipated my response. It pushed from a different direction, from behind and to the side, using my own momentum and movement against me. I was pushed toward the railing with far greater force than before. This time, the pushing didn't stop when I screamed. This time, the entity seemed intent on completing whatever it had started. I felt my torso collide with the metal railing. I felt myself beginning to lift, my feet leaving the concrete, my body being forced over the edge. And then I felt something else. Another presence. Another entity, pushing back against the first one. Another invisible force, opposing the force that was attempting to throw me from the bridge. Two supernatural entities, locked in some kind of struggle, using my body as the battleground. I was held suspended for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, caught between two opposing forces, dangling partially over the railing of the high-level bridge, looking down at the river hundreds of feet below, understanding with complete clarity that I was about to die. Then the resistance won. I was pulled backward, away from the railing, and I fell onto the concrete of the walkway. The two presences seemed to collide above me, and there was a sound like shattering glass, like something breaking in a dimension adjacent to our own. And then both presences vanished. I lay on the bridge, gasping, unable to move, unable to process what had just happened. I experienced something that defied every category of reality I understood. I'd been attacked by an invisible entity and saved by another invisible entity, and I had no explanation for either phenomenon. This time, I reported the incident to the RCMP. The police took my statement, and I described the attacks, the invisible force, the sensation of being pushed toward the railing. The officers listened without interrupting, and I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They suggested that I was experiencing panic attacks, that I was having some kind of psychological episode, that the sensation of being pushed was likely a manifestation of anxiety or stress-related dissociation. I insisted that something had actually touched me, that the force I felt was physical, real, external. But I could see them reaching the conclusion that I was mentally unstable, that I needed psychiatric evaluation, that the experiences I was describing were psychological rather than physical phenomena. Before they left, one of the officers mentioned something that changed everything. He said that I wasn't the first person to report being pushed on the high-level bridge. There had been multiple incidents over the past several years, incidents where people had claimed they were attacked by invisible forces, incidents where people had nearly fallen from the bridge and had been saved only by intervention from other pedestrians or by some unexplained reversal of the pushing force. Most of these cases had been classified as mental health crises or suicide attempts. The individuals making the reports had been assessed by psychiatrists, had been determined to have underlying mental illness, and had been treated for their conditions. But the officer said there was something odd about the pattern. There was a cluster of these incidents, concentrated in a specific section of the bridge, occurring at specific times of day, affecting people who had no prior history of mental illness or suicidal ideation. It was statistically unusual enough to have caught his attention, even though the official conclusions attributed all the incidents to psychological dysfunction. He told me that if I was interested, I could look into the case files, that the bridge authority and the local police had documentation of the incidents, that I could see if the patterns matched my own experience. I spent the next 3 months researching the history of the High Level Bridge. I obtained police reports, incident documentation, suicide statistics, everything that the authorities had filed regarding unusual deaths or attempted jumps from the bridge. And the pattern was undeniable and horrifying. Going back over 30 years, there were documented incidents of people claiming they had been pushed from the bridge. The numbers were small, perhaps 1 or 2 per year, but they were consistent. People who had no history of depression or suicidal ideation suddenly finding themselves at the railing and claiming they'd been attacked by invisible forces. Some of them survived because other pedestrians intervened. Some of them survived because they managed to grab onto something and hold on until help arrived. And some of them didn't survive. The official cause of death for all of them was suicide, but the pattern suggested something else entirely. These weren't people with mental illness choosing to end their lives. These were people who were being attacked by something invisible, something that was attempting to force them from the bridge, something that existed on the High Level Bridge and had been doing this for decades. I found a historical reference that made me understand what I was dealing with. Going back to the 1880s, when the bridge was first constructed, there were reports from the workers who built it. They described experiencing a cold presence on the bridge, a sensation of being watched, incidents where workers would feel pushed or shoved by invisible forces. Several workers had actually died during construction, incidents officially attributed to accidents, falls, equipment malfunctions. But the worker accounts suggested something else. There were journal entries from one of the construction foremen, a man named James Whitmore, who documented his experience in meticulous detail. He wrote about sensing a presence on the bridge, something that seemed to exist in a space just outside normal perception. He wrote about feeling pressure and force, about shadows moving where no shadows should exist, about an overwhelming sense that the bridge was occupied by something intelligent and malevolent. And then his journal entries stopped. James Whitmore had disappeared while working on the bridge. His body was never recovered. The bridge was completed, and the incidents were forgotten, lost in the historical record, dismissed as the superstitious fears of construction workers. But something had remained in that structure, something that had been there from the moment the bridge was built, something that had continued to hunt people for over 100 years. I formed a theory that terrified me in its implications. The High Level Bridge wasn't just a structure. It was a gateway or a focal point, a location where something could manifest more completely than it could in other places. The bridge might have been built on a location that was already haunted, or the construction of the bridge itself might have created a wound in reality that something was using to reach into our world. The entity that was pushing people from the bridge wasn't trying to kill them necessarily. It was testing them, assessing them, determining something about their consciousness or their will or their suitability for some unknown purpose. And the times when it seemed to stop pushing, the times when I and others were saved from falling, those might have been moments when the entity had determined we didn't meet whatever criteria it was using to select its prey. I attempted to warn the authorities of my conclusions. I brought my research to the RCMP, documented the historical pattern, presented my theory about the bridge being a focal point for supernatural activity. The response was predictable. The police suggested that I was connecting unrelated incidents, that I was seeing patterns where none existed, that I was becoming obsessive about my initial traumatic experience. They recommended psychiatric evaluation and counseling. They suggested that my continued focus on the bridge and on finding a supernatural explanation was itself a symptom of psychological illness. They politely but firmly closed the case and indicated that they didn't believe I was in immediate danger of self-harm. What they were actually communicating was that they had no framework for investigating what I was describing, and rather than acknowledge the existence of something that contradicted their understanding of reality, they chose to dismiss me as mentally unstable. So the truth about the High Level Bridge remained buried, but the incidents continued. Every month, I would read news reports about people falling from the bridge, incidents classified as suicides despite the lack of prior mental health issues. I would study the details and find the same pattern repeating itself. People in specific locations on the bridge, people who reported experiencing strange phenomena before falling, people whose deaths made no sense except if you understood that something invisible was attacking them. I also continued experiencing the entity, its presence. I found that I couldn't avoid the bridge anymore. It began manifesting in my dreams, calling to me, inviting me to return. I experienced overwhelming compulsions to walk across that bridge, to return to the location where the pushing had occurred, to re-expose myself to the presence that had nearly killed me. I resisted the compulsions as best I could, but they grew stronger with each passing week. I began to suspect that the entity had marked me as I walked across the bridge, that my encounter with whatever was inhabiting that structure had created a connection, a link that allowed it to reach toward me even when I was far away from the bridge. I also realized something else that terrified me. The presence that had saved me, the second entity that had pushed back against the force attempting to throw me from the bridge, was still observing me. I could feel it, a different kind of presence than the hostile entity on the bridge. Something that seemed to be protecting me, but that was also studying me, learning about me, developing some kind of interest in my consciousness. I had been selected by two different supernatural entities, one that wanted to destroy me and one that wanted to protect me, and I existed now in the space between them, constantly aware of their attention, constantly trying to resist the compulsion to return to the high-level bridge where their contest would continue. 3 years have passed since my first encounter on the bridge. The compulsion to return has grown almost unbearable. I find myself driving toward the bridge at night without consciously deciding to do so. I wake up in my car parked near the bridge with no memory of driving there. I've made actual attempts to walk across the bridge multiple times, only managing to stop myself through sheer force of will. And I've learned something new and more disturbing about what is happening there. The bridge has become known as a suicide location, a place where people go when they want to end their lives. But I believe that reputation is being created deliberately, that the entity on the bridge is cultivating that image, using it to attract vulnerable people, using it to provide cover for the attacks it is conducting. When someone falls from the bridge, it is automatically assumed to be a suicide. No one investigates the possibility of supernatural attack. No one questions the circumstances with rigor because the location has been established as a suicide hotspot. The entity has learned to hide its activities behind the statistical reality of self-harm and depression. I believe the high-level bridge isn't just a place where people die. I believe it is a location where an entity is harvesting consciousness, selecting specific people, determining their suitability for some unknown transformation or utilization. And I believe next. The compulsion to return to the bridge is becoming overwhelming. I can feel the two entities pulling at me from opposite directions. The hostile one inviting me to return so it can complete the attack it started 3 years ago, and the protective one insisting that I must come back so it can determine what I meant to become. I'm writing this account as a final warning and a final confession. If you ever find yourself on the high-level bridge in Edmonton, if you ever feel a sudden drop in temperature, if you ever sense a presence observing you from just outside your perception, then you need to leave immediately. Dawn, to try to investigate. Dawn, to try to confront whatever is there. Run as fast as you can toward the nearest exit. And if you feel invisible hands pushing you, if you feel pressure forcing you toward the railing, dawn, to resist. Scream. Make noise. Try to attract the attention of other people. Because the only reason I am alive is that my screams brought people to help me, and because something else intervened to save me. The high-level bridge is haunted by something that has been killing people for over 100 years. Something that has learned to hide its activities within the statistics of suicide. Something that is still actively hunting and still selecting prey. And very soon, I am going to return to that bridge, and I am going to finally discover what the two entities that have been fighting over me actually want. I am going to learn whether the protective presence is actually protecting me or simply preserving me for some purpose that I can't yet imagine. The bridge is calling, and I don't think I can resist much longer. Story 7. Haunted Mines of Sudbury. I heard knocking from deep underground in the sealed mines of Sudbury, Ontario. Knocking that came from tunnels that had been permanently closed for over a decade, and I made the mistake of investigating where that sound was coming from. My name is Robert Calloway, and I spent 28 years working as a mining engineer in the Sudbury Basin. I know those mines better than I know my own home. I've walked every tunnel that is still in operation. I've mapped every shaft. I've documented the depth and the danger of every working section. I was trained to understand the sounds of the earth, to recognize the difference between the settling of rock and the warning signs of a cave-in, to hear the subtle shifts that indicated danger. But the knocking I heard in September 2019 came from somewhere that should have been completely silent. I was working on final maintenance checks in the Garson mine, the largest nickel mine in the Western Hemisphere. The mine stretches down nearly 2 kilometers below the surface, with tunnels that extend horizontally for miles in every direction. It is an enormous, complex structure, a labyrinth of passages and chambers that most people would find absolutely terrifying to navigate. But not me. I felt safer underground than I did on the surface. I understood the mine, I respected it, and I knew every section that was safe and every section that was dangerous. On that particular day, I was in a section called the deep level, approximately 1,900 feet below the surface. The air was cool and still, untouched by wind or weather. The walls of the tunnel were exposed nickel-bearing rock, streaked with minerals that occasionally caught the beam of my headlamp and glowed in the darkness. That is when I heard it. A single, deliberate knock, echoing through the tunnel ahead of me. I stopped moving immediately and listened carefully. Knocking in a mine was not unusual. Knocking could indicate equipment malfunction, or support structures settling, or the small earthquakes that occasionally occurred in the region. But this knock had been deliberate, purposeful, structured. It had sounded almost like a signal. I waited, listening for additional sounds. After several minutes of silence, I continued moving forward. But my attention was now focused entirely on the sounds around me, listening for any indication of structural failure or equipment malfunction that might require immediate attention. Then I heard it again. 3 knocks, equally spaced, coming from directly ahead of me in the darkness. I increased my pace, moving toward the sound. I wanted to determine the source, to understand what was producing these knocking sounds in a section of the mine that should have been completely stable and completely empty. As I moved deeper into the tunnel, the knocking continued, always ahead of me, always at approximately the same distance, as if whatever was making the sound was retreating at the same pace that I was advancing. I reached a junction in the tunnel where 2 passages intersected. The knocking seemed to be coming from the left passage, the one that led toward some of the oldest sections of the mine. Tunnels that had been mined decades ago and that were now sealed off with steel bulkheads to prevent access to unstable sections. I followed the knocking toward the bulkhead. The steel barrier was still intact, still sealed, with warning signs posted indicating that the section beyond was closed to all personnel. The knocking seemed to be coming from just beyond the barrier, from inside the sealed tunnel. But that was impossible. There was no way anything could be knocking from the other side of a sealed barrier. Unless something was already inside the sealed section. Something that had been locked in when the tunnel was sealed. Something that had been trapped underground for years. Knocking, trying to attract attention, trying to signal for help. I checked my radio, intending to report the discovery to the surface. But the radio was dead. No static, no signal, nothing. The radio just gave me silence, which was unsettling because the mine, its radio systems were redundant and should have allowed me to communicate from nearly any depth. The knocking continued. 3 distinct impacts, spaced at regular intervals, coming from the sealed tunnel. I studied the bulkhead, looking for any indication of tampering or damage. The barrier appeared completely intact. The seal was solid. There was no way to access the tunnel beyond. Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. There was a mark on the steel bulkhead, a handprint, visible in the dust that had accumulated on the barrier. The handprint was relatively fresh, made within the last few days at most. The dust compressed by the pressure of a human hand against the metal surface. Someone or something had been pressing against the barrier from the inside. I was experiencing a creepy sensation of dread, a realization that something was very wrong with this situation. The knocking continued, relentless, maddening in its consistency. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, over and over again, as if the entity on the other side of the barrier was determined to communicate something, to make its presence known, to demand acknowledgement. I made a decision that I now recognize was foolish. I began examining the bulkhead more closely, looking for any damage or weakness in the seal. The barrier was a permanent structure, welded into place, designed to be completely impenetrable. But as I studied it, I noticed something odd. The welds showed signs of stress. The metal around the seal was slightly discolored, as if it had been subjected to extreme heat at some point in the recent past. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, more terrifying than the knocking had been. I waited, listening, but there was no further sound from beyond the barrier. Whatever had been knocking was now silent, observing me, perhaps aware that I was studying the seal. perhaps evaluating whether I posed a threat or an opportunity. I backed away from the bulkhead and returned to the main tunnel. I made my way to the nearest elevator shaft and ascended toward the surface. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing with questions that I couldn't answer. When I reached the surface, I immediately reported the knocking and the handprint to my supervisor. I described the sealed tunnel, the impossibility of anything being trapped inside, the stress marks on the bulkhead. My supervisor listened without interrupting, and then he told me something that turned my blood cold. He said that I wasn't the first person to report knocking from the sealed sections of the mine. Over the past several months, multiple workers had reported similar incidents. Knocking sounds coming from tunnels that had been sealed for years. Sounds that seemed to come from impossible locations. Workers describing the feeling of being watched when they were near the sealed sections. And one worker, a man named Adrian Forbert, had become so disturbed by the knocking that he requested transfer to a different mine. Adrian had told my supervisor that he believed something was trying to communicate from the sealed tunnels, something that had been trapped underground for a long time. My supervisor said that Adrian's request had been approved, and Adrian was now working in a mine in Saskatchewan, far from Sudbury. But the incidents had continued after Adrian left, suggesting that whatever was producing the knocking was not connected to any individual worker, just imagination or stress. I asked my supervisor why I hadn't been informed of these incidents before I went down into the mine. He said that the knocking was being investigated, that they were trying to determine the cause before jumping to any conclusions. He suggested that it could be settling in the rock structure, that it could be equipment malfunction, that it could be any number of mundane explanations. But his tone suggested he didn't believe any of those explanations. Over the next week, I researched the history of the Sudbury mines. I discovered historical documentation, newspaper articles, and mining records going back to the earliest days of the mining operation. And I found something that made me understand the scope of what I was dealing with. In the early 1900s, the Sudbury mines were significantly more extensive than they are today. Miners worked deeper, going further into tunnels that were later abandoned due to instability or depleted resources. In 1903, a collapse occurred in a section of the mine known as the Northern Deep Shaft. The collapse trapped 12 miners underground. A rescue operation was mounted immediately, but when the rescuers reached the trapped miners, they found something horrifying. The trapped miners had been dead for days, but not from suffocation or injuries sustained in the collapse. Their bodies showed signs of violence, as if they'd been attacked by something. Their clothing was torn, their skin was marked with deep gouges, and their faces bore expressions of absolute terror. The official investigation concluded that the collapse had triggered a panic among the trapped miners, that they fought with each other in their desperation to escape, and that several of them had been killed in the violence. The conclusion blamed human panic rather than any external threat, but the descriptions in the rescue reports suggested something different. One rescuer had written in his personal journal that the condition of the bodies indicated they'd been attacked by something large, something with claws or sharp implements, something that had deliberately inflicted injury on each of the trapped miners. The journal entry ended with a note that the rescue supervisor had ordered all miners to keep silent about the actual condition of the bodies. The official story was to be that the miners had killed each other in panic. Nothing else was to be reported. The Northern Deep Shaft was permanently sealed after the incident, and the area was declared unsafe for mining operations. I researched further and found additional incidents scattered throughout the mine, this history. In 1927, a tunneling crew encountered something in a section of the mine that they described only as activity. The crew had abandoned their work immediately and refused to return to that section. The tunnel was sealed off by order of the mine management. In 1956, miners reported seeing movement in the deeper sections, shapes moving in the darkness that didn't match any known animal. Again, the tunnels were sealed. Again, the incidents were covered up. And in 1998, during the last major mining operation in the deep-level sections, multiple miners reported hearing voices coming from the walls, voices that seemed to be calling their names, voices that emanated from deep within the earth itself. 3 miners quit their jobs that same week. One of them, according to an old newspaper article one found, had been admitted to a psychiatric facility and had spent the rest of his life unable to coherently describe what he experienced in the mine. The pattern was undeniable. Something existed in the deepest sections of the Sudbury mines. something that had been there for at least 100 years. Something that was intelligent and aware and actively hostile to human presence. I brought my research to the mine management and to the mining safety board. I documented the historical incidents, presented the pattern analysis, and argued that the sealed sections should remain sealed. That no attempt should be made to investigate what was causing the knocking. The response was institutional dismissal. My supervisor said I was connecting unrelated incidents, that I was becoming obsessed with superstition, that I needed to maintain objectivity and professionalism. He suggested that my position as a mining engineer was contingent on my ability to set aside superstitious fears and focus on the practical realities of mining operations. In other words, he was telling me to keep silent. But I couldn't keep silent. I continued researching, continued documenting, continued trying to understand what was happening in the sealed sections of the Sudbury mines. And then something changed. The knocking began occurring not just in the sealed sections, but in the active sections as well. Workers reported hearing it during their shifts, knocking coming from areas that had no reason to produce such sounds. And the knocking seemed to be increasing in frequency and intensity, as if whatever was producing it was becoming more aggressive, more determined to communicate or to break through the barriers that were keeping it contained. I also began experiencing something disturbing in my personal life. I started having dreams about the mines, nightmares where I was descending into tunnels that went deeper than the actual mine extended, tunnels that seemed to go down forever into the earth. In these dreams, I would hear the knocking, and I would follow it, descending deeper and deeper into darkness, unable to stop myself, unable to resist the compulsion to find the source of the sound. And in the deepest parts of these dreams, I would see something. A shape in the darkness, something massive and ancient, something that had been waiting in the earth for centuries, something that was aware of my presence and was interested in me specifically. I began to suspect that the knocking wasn't too random. I began to think that whatever was producing it was trying to attract my attention, trying to call me back to the mine, trying to communicate something specific to me. I requested a leave of absence from my job, telling management that I needed time to deal with personal issues. They granted the request, and I left Sudbury temporarily, hoping that distance from the mine would help me escape the compulsion to return, the sense that something underground was calling to me. But the dreams continued, and they became more vivid, more detailed. I began to understand that the entity in the mine, whatever it was, had marked me somehow. It had selected me, perhaps because I heard its knocking directly, perhaps because I approached the sealed bulkhead and demonstrated an awareness of its presence. Whatever the reason, it was focused on me now, pulling at my consciousness, drawing me back toward Sudbury, toward the mine, toward the depths where it dwelt. I tried to resist. I moved to a different city. I found work in a different industry, far removed from mining. I tried to build a life that had nothing to do with the Sudbury mines and the horror that existed in their depths. But after 6 months of distance, the compulsion became overwhelming. I found myself driving toward Sudbury. I couldn't explain the decision. My hands moved the steering wheel. My feet worked the pedals. But it wasn't entirely me making those choices. Something in my mind that wasn't entirely my own was directing my actions, pulling me back toward the mine, insisting that I return to the place where the knocking had first called to me. I arrived in Sudbury and went directly to the mine management office. I requested reinstatement to my position. They were surprised by my sudden return, but they accepted me back without question. Within days, I was back working in the deep-level sections of the mine, back in the darkness, back in proximity to the sealed tunnels where the knocking continued its relentless pattern. And the knocking intensified. It was no longer coming from behind the bulkheads. It was coming from the very walls of the tunnel I was working in, from the rock itself, as if the entity was moving closer, trying to break through to me, trying to reach me directly. I began to understand what was happening. The sealed tunnels weren't holding anything back anymore. Whatever had been trapped in the depths of the mine was slowly breaking free, working its way through the rock, pushing against the barriers that had been erected to contain it. And it was focused on me, using the knocking as a signal, calling me deeper into the mine, preparing me for something. I am writing this account from my apartment in Sudbury, and I'm not sure how much longer I can resist the compulsion to return to the mine. The knocking has become audible even here, even though I'm hundreds of feet above the surface. I can hear it in my walls at night, echoing from somewhere deep below, calling my name in a pattern that my mind is learning to interpret. I believe that the sealed tunnels are about to fail. I believe that whatever has been imprisoned in the depths of the Sudbury mines for over a century is finally breaking free. And I believe that when it emerges, it will be looking for me first, the person it marked, the person it called back to the mine. The entity in the mines of Sudbury is real. It is intelligent. It's been waiting, knocking, calling from the darkness for over 100 years. And very soon, the knocking will stop, because whatever is producing that sound will have finally broken through to the surface. And it will be coming for the person it marked. It will be coming for me. I can hear the knocking now, even as I write this. 3 distinct impacts, spaced at regular intervals, closer than ever before, coming from directly beneath my apartment building. And I know that I am going to have to go back to the mine one final time, to descend into the darkness, to meet whatever waits in the sealed tunnels, to understand finally what has been calling to me all this time. The knocking never stops. It only gets louder. And very soon, it's going to take me with it into the darkness below. 7 stories. 7 warnings from a country that wants you to believe it is safe. Remember what I promised? The survival pattern that connects every case? Here it is. Listen carefully. Every Canadian who vanished made the same critical error. They heard something calling them and they answered. The children heard singing and opened their windows. The hitchhikers heard reasonable explanations and got into vehicles. The campers heard cries for help and went searching. The bridge victims heard compulsions and walked toward railings. The survival rule is simple but counterintuitive. When something in the Canadian wilderness calls to you, whether it is a voice, a compulsion, a sound that shouldn't exist, you must do the opposite of what every instinct tells you. Don, to answer. Don, to investigate. Don, to help. Silence and stillness are your only defense. Why? Because these entities hunt by triggering our deepest human responses: curiosity, compassion, the need to help others. They spent centuries learning exactly which sounds make us respond. The moment you answer, you remarked, claimed, already walking toward them even if your feet haven't moved yet. Now here is what keeps me awake. 3 days ago, I received an unmarked package. Inside was a recorder from Stanley Park with 47 minutes of audio. It captured something the official investigation missed. The screamer wasn't just vocalizing. It was learning names. Every hiker who reported hearing it provided data. And now it knows exactly what to call to make you respond. If you haven't subscribed to Vesper Shroud, do it now. When we hit 200,000 subscribers, I am traveling to Highway 16 with thermal cameras and investigators who agreed to break their NDAs. We documenting what picks up hitchhikers at night. You will vote on which section of the highway we investigate. Your choice might save someone's life or cost us ours. Destroy that like button if these Canadian horrors made you check your windows. If you will never trust a crying voice in darkness again. If the singing from rivers will haunt your dreams tonight. Drop a comment telling me which story disturbed you most. The black-eyed driver haunts me. Something wore that human face. Have you experienced unexplained calls or compulsions in wilderness? Would you answer if you heard your name called from darkness? Be honest. Did you catch the lighthouse detail in story number 3? Any encounters with Canadian wilderness entities? Your testimony might be featured next. Share this video, but warn them first. Tell them to watch before midnight. Tell them to keep their windows closed. Because 3 viewers have reported hearing their names called from outside after watching. Voices that knew details only family members should know. Before you go, I need to confess something. My sister disappeared near the South Saskatchewan River in 2017. She was found 3 days later with no memory of where she'd been. But she stopped singing the same melody the River Woman uses. She doesn't know why. She can control it. And every month, she walks closer to the river before we can stop her. I am not stopping this investigation. Every story I share is ammunition against what hunts in Canada. Every subscriber who learns these patterns is someone who might resist the call. Every comment builds evidence that authorities can ignore forever. Saskatoon, Vancouver, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, Sudbury, the horror isn't isolated. It is coordinated, connected, growing stronger as entities learn from each successful hunt. They read not random predators. They read strategic hunters who adapted to exploit every weakness in human psychology. Some of you will hear the call. You will feel the sudden cold on the high level bridge. You will hear singing from rivers at night. You LLC movement in Stanley Park trees. And in that moment, you will remember this video. You will remember the silence rule. And you will resist. Others will answer. And Canada will claim them. The River Woman is still singing to children. The Highway 16 driver is still selecting prey. The lighthouse presences are still climbing empty stairs. And the mines are still knocking closer to the surface every year, breaking through seals that were supposed to last forever. Canada, its wilderness is vast, beautiful, and it is hunting. This is Vesper Shroud, reminding you that silence isn't to weakness. Sometimes it is the only thing between you and entities that have been perfecting their calls for centuries. Stay quiet, stay still, stay subscribed.